This is Unit 5, Lesson 2, Weathering and Erosion. Our learning target: I can compare and contrast weathering and erosion. Our success criteria: I can describe the similarities and differences between weathering and erosion and give examples of each. So we've been talking about rocks a lot and how they form and the different types of rocks, and now we're going to talk about how they break down. So we'll start with this idea of weathering. Weathering is the breaking up or breakup of rock due to exposure to the atmosphere. So this happens to rocks that are at the surface, not the rocks that are buried deep below ground, but the rocks that are exposed at the surface to the atmosphere. So two things like weather. They are not the same as weather. So rain is not weathering, but rain can cause weathering. So any type of weather event can cause weathering, but please don't confuse them. I know that the words sound very similar, but they're not interchangeable. And then there's two main types of weathering that we're going to talk about. The first is called chemical, and the second is called mechanical or physical, and those words can be used interchangeably. We'll start by talking about chemical weathering. Chemical weathering is a chemical change that occurs in a rock. So like we learned about chemical and physical changes, this takes place when at least some of the rock's minerals are changed into different substances. So something's actually being permanently altered inside this rock. Some examples of chemical weathering are acid rain, rainwater, and oxidation. Our first example is something called oxidation. So if you look around here, this may look something that's kind of familiar. You have this reddish color. This is just very simply rust, if we want to uncomplicate it. But oxidation is the reaction of a substance with oxygen. So just a general definition of the word oxidation. And this is the process that causes rust. So there are iron inside the minerals in the rocks that reacts with oxygen to form an iron oxide, and that weakens the rocks. So this part of this rock here, or my pointer went, okay. That's kind of this orangey color. This is what is rusting or oxidizing, and as that's happening, it's breaking down the existing minerals. It's creating that iron oxide, and it's becoming weaker, so it's becoming more susceptible or easier to change or easier to break down. And remember, weathering is the breaking down of rocks that are exposed to the atmosphere. So this area here, this ring outside, all of that has been exposed, and then the area inside isn't. So someone took this rock and cut it, and the outer edges had all been exposed to the atmosphere, but the inside had not yet been exposed to the atmosphere. So over time, eventually, as those outer layers wear away, you'll have weathering continuing with that rock over time. Next type of chemical weathering we have is called water hydrolysis. Hydrolysis, so we have the prefix hydro in here, right, for water. This occurs when water combines with the substances in rocks to form new types of substances. So the water is actually changing the rock into something else. And the new substances that form are softer than the original rock. This is the most common type of chemical weathering. So it partially has to do with what the rock was originally made of, what minerals were there, and whether or not they are easy to break down through the process of hydrolysis. But because water is everywhere on the Earth's surface, and it rains in most places in the Earth except for deserts, hydrolysis is going to be our largest type of weathering. And also we have water in streams and rivers and oceans as well. So anytime a rock is exposed to water, it's going to undergo this process of hydrolysis. Then we have mechanical or physical weathering. So unlike chemical weathering, mechanical or physical weathering just is physically breaking the rocks into fragments, but it is not changing the chemical makeup of the minerals. So this is a physical change, not a chemical change. And all you're doing is taking the rock and breaking it up. Some examples of mechanical weathering are frost wedging. So frost wedging occurs when there is a crack in the rock, so like this, and you have alternating periods of freezing and thawing of that water. So if you think about overnight, it gets cold, it freezes, so that water expands, As that water expands, it pushes the rocks apart. Then during the day, it thaws, comes back together. And those alternating periods of freezing and thawing eventually will cause rocks to break into pieces. This is a very common form of weathering here where we live, especially in the winter time. It gets cold enough at night to freeze, but during the day it warms up enough to melt. This is one of the reasons that we get all those large potholes in the road as well. So I'll show you a video of kind of how this works, just to explain it a little bit. So you have freezing inside this crack here, and then it's thawing again. And then at night it freezes. See how it's expanding here? And then it's thawing again. And eventually those rocks will fall off. Okay, then the next kind of weathering we have is called next type of mechanical weathering is called root wedging or biological weathering. So either of those names could be used. A lot of things in this unit, there's words kind of used interchangeably, so I'm trying to include all of those vocabulary words as they may come up. So root wedging is when you have plants growing into rock cracks and causing fractures. So this is obviously a tree. So this is a tree trunk growing into a rock and it's breaking it down over time. You can also see this in things as small as like small weeds growing up through cracks in sidewalks or cracks in driveways. The tree example is a little bit more powerful of an image. And then here we are back at McKee. So here's our deli and the street that McKee is on, and Fort Hill Place here. So when you walk from the school down to the deli, if you're not careful about where your feet are, you may get stuck on a piece of sidewalk. And what you'll notice if you look to your left as you're walking towards the deli is that there are trees over there, and those tree roots have actually uprooted the sidewalk in places. And you'll notice it all around this area, all around this St. George neighborhood if you're walking around. I mean, you'll notice it anywhere that there's trees, planted near a sidewalk. So next time you're walking and you trip on something randomly and you didn't see it, look around and see if maybe there's a tree there, and that might be the reason why the sidewalk is out of place. So another kind of mechanical weathering is called exfoliation. This is the peeling off of sheets of rock as they expand and crack. So it's just a lot of times through heat, those upper layers get heated, they expand, they cool down, and eventually they just kind of crack off in pieces. The next type of mechanical or physical weathering, and probably the most popular, is abrasion. This is caused by both wind and water as rock fragments bounce off each other. So frequently it's rock fragments in the size of sand, so very small sediments moving. It could be larger pieces as well. This is common in desert areas, so like this image here. You have sand that's being blown by the wind, sand blasting these rocks, breaking them down over time. And then you also have it in beaches and streams. So anywhere that there's water, you're going to have this kind of abrasion as well. And what abrasion does is it makes the rocks nice and rounded. And then the last thing I just want to talk about briefly is touch on this idea of erosion. I want to introduce it now because they are separate ideas, although a lot of times they go together. Erosion is the transport of weathered materials. So transport meaning movement. So anytime you have materials that have been broken down or weathered, if they begin moving somewhere, then you have erosion. The four main types of erosion are wind, water, gravity, and waves, and we'll talk about all four of those as we move through this unit. And just to recap, because I don't want us to get confused, weathering is the breaking down of rocks and minerals. So they're breaking down. Erosion is the transport or movement of weathered materials. So here I have water erosion transporting the sediments down the hill. So they broke here, and then it rained, and they moved downhill. Now, you could also have weathering happening while they're moving downhill, but they are separate processes. So our learning target was to compare and contrast weathering and erosion. Our success criteria, I can describe the similarities and differences between weathering and erosion and give examples of each.